Hey guys, this is Jessica Noam here in Chicago at Trax Studios with Reverb, and today we are filming another episode of What's That Sound, focusing on the drum sound of Bob Marley and the Wailers, featuring the sounds of their drummer Carlton Barrett. So for the drums, we used a Yamaha Jimmy Chamberlain model snare with the bottom head and snares taken off, a piece of acoustic foam on the inside, and we cranked the head way up so that there was just a lot of tension in the top head. For our toms, we used a 13-inch rack tom and a 16-inch floor tom, both Gretsch, and we put towels over them to really dampen them. For our kick drum, we used a Ludwig Vistalite with the front head taken off of it, and it's stuffed with a sleeping bag to really dampen it. And for our kick drum beater, we used a larger, softer beater for this sound.
We started listening to a bunch of Bob Marley songs to try to figure out this drum sound. The first thing that we noticed was that the cymbals and the drums were super separated from each other. They were separated in sound, and they were also separated in stereo field, right? The hi-hat would be super far right, the snare would be super center, and you wouldn't really hear, in a typical drum sound where the drums sound like one thing, you hear the space that the hi-hat takes up stereo-wise, you hear snare there, right? And the space that the snare takes up, you hear hi-hat in that space, right? The reason for that is that you have bleed between those two instruments. A snare drum and a hi-hat are sometimes 3 inches away from each other, 4 inches away from each other. So of course there's going to be some hi-hat that gets into the snare mic, there's going to be some snare that gets into the hi-hat mic. The second thing that we noticed was that the hi-hat felt super detailed. Right? It did not feel like there was a lot of room around it. Everything felt really close. Everything felt really tight. From that information, we figured out that they must have been using overheads that were super close to the drum. So generally, overheads, you might stick them 6 feet off the ground, something like that, sometimes more. In this case, we used overheads that were maybe 6 inches off of the cymbals, right? They don't give a very realistic image of what the entire drum set sounds like, but they give a really detailed image of a hi-hat over here and maybe a crash over here. To fill that in, we added direct microphones. We had a direct mic for the snare, we had a direct mic for the kick, and we had a direct mic for the tom. Those drums, the direct mics are pretty much the entire sound of that drum, right? The only exception is there's a little bit of sizzle on top that comes from the overheads that helps kind of round out that sound. But for the most part, we're not looking for these direct mics to just be like reinforcement on the drum. We're looking for it to be the entire drum sound. So our microphones for this drum sound on the kick drum, FET 47, pillowy, huge sound, stuck it about 3 inches outside of the shell, something like that. On the snare drum, we used a Beyer 201. Similar sound to a 57, but it's a little bit more well-rounded, it's a little less mid-rangey, and to that we added some EQ to add some high-end and some low-end. On the overheads, we used AKG 451s. Now, those are not typical overheads for like a rock project or something that needs the overheads to have a full body to make up the entire drum sound. But in this case, all we're looking for is the cymbals, and we're just looking for them to be really detailed, really clean, high-end, so 451s worked great. And then lastly, we put a 421 on our toms, a classic tom sound, use those for the direct mics on the toms. Let's listen to all the mics. We're gonna start with the overheads. They don't sound like drums in a room, right? They don't sound like how drums sound like when you stick your head in front of a drum kit, right? The reason behind this is we put these mics very low and we put them really wide, very unnaturally wide, right? So unnaturally wide that they could cause some kind of phase issues if we relied too heavily on them for the snare drum. But luckily, we're going to mostly use the direct mic for the snare drum. I also am leaning these mics, right? I have my left side and my right side. My right side I'm not going to use that much. I'm going to lean mostly on my left side. That's where all the information is. On other drum sounds where you're looking for those overheads to be like a complete stereo image of the kit, this is a big no-no to, like, you know, take the drums out of balance like that. But again, today that's not really what we're doing, so we don't care. Let's add in the snare. Sounds the way that it's supposed to sound. Sounds like it does on the record, right? Here's with the overheads. Sounds super cool. Let's add in the kick drum. Kick drum is just like a bundle of fluff. It is nothing. It's literally a kick drum without a lot of high end to begin with, played with like a pillow essentially, and just feathered in, and then we stuck a mic that is also gonna add a lot of body, and we also took away some of the high end from it, right? So all that kick drum is doing, it's giving us a ton of this like low end focus, and that's what's gonna really make this sound blend with the bass once the bass goes into it. Tom sounds great. So the snare and the tom both have a little bit of foam in them, right? We did that to further deaden the sound, but the result is that like this tom almost sounds like a kick drum essentially, right? And when we put it in with the rest of the sound, it sounds super well balanced, it sounds super impactful, and sounds like the way that I hear these toms sounding on these records. The last thing we're gonna add is a little bit of reverb. We used an EMT 140 plate, right? 2 seconds, filtered off the input so that it didn't have too much of the kick drum coming through it. And we fed a little bit of the snare drum and the tom to that, and it just gives like this kind of glaze over the whole drum kit. Let's listen to the whole thing together. That was our take on the Bob Marley and the Wailers drum sound.
Thanks for watching another episode of What's That Sound? Let us know in the comments what other artists and songs you'd like to hear us break down, and we'll see you next time.